afternoon's episode of Restoring the Sciences. This is a webinar series that's hosted by the National Association of Scholars. I'm Scott Turner. I'm Director of Science Programs here at the NAS, and I'm the regular host of this webinar. It's quite easy to get the impression that we're driving our planet to disaster, primarily through the use of CO2 producing fossil fuels. What was global warming or climate change has now morphed into dire pronouncements of the climate emergency, in quotes, or even climate catastrophe, also in quotes. We see the same message not only from our politicians, but on network news programs, where what really, if you think about it, should be a local story, that is, the weather, is now a regular segment on many evening news programs. And this is often accompanied by imagery of raging floods, burning forests, devastating tornadoes, and hurricanes. And all of this is delivered with ominous implications that this is somehow different from the past. And all of this has an aim, of course, and that is to support a narrative that we all have to do something, it doesn't matter what, and to make big sacrifices to save the planet. Our guest today is Dr. Ralph B. Alexander, who's having none of this. Ralph is a former professor of physics at Wayne State University. He earned a PhD in physics from the University of Oxford. And since retiring from Wayne State, he's been many things, among them a science entrepreneur, as well as a prolific science writer, all of his activities dedicated to countering the increasing politicization of science and to return science to its proper wheelhouse of objectivity, data, and dispassionate inquiry. His public face today operates mainly through his blog, which is accurately named Science Under Attack. You might remember that this was the title of last week's webinar with Lawrence Krauss. But in Ralph's case, Science Under Attack is the title of his most famous book, which is subtitled, appropriately, The Age of Unreason and Global Warming False Alarm. He's also a regular contributor to Clintel, an association of climate skeptics, or as I call them, climate realists, and he's enough of a gadfly to the climate change agenda that he has been smeared by DeSmog, a badge of honor in my humble opinion. Before I turn the floor over to Ralph, I'd like to just outline a couple of housekeeping details. We'll devote about 45 minutes to a presentation from Ralph and some discussion of it afterwards. And after that, we'll open the floor to questions from you, the audience. We like you to put questions in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. You just hover your mouse over the Zoom screen and the Q&A box will pop up at the bottom. We can handle questions in the chat box as well, but we prefer Q&A just because it's a little bit more interactive. And also, I'd like to emphasize that you can put your questions in there at any time during the seminar, during a discussion, or what have you. In other words, you don't have to wait for the floor to open the questions to put in your questions. Okay, with that introduction, I'd like to welcome you, Ralph, to Restoring the Sciences. We're really glad you're here, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Scott. I'm very pleased to be part of your Restoring the Sciences series. And today my topic is climate and weather extremes. This is but a small corner of climate science, where unfortunately the science is rapidly becoming lost. Okay, at the moment I do not see my slides. I'm trying to find, to bring my slides up here.
Looks like they're coming. There we are.
Yes, okay. Okay,
we've got the slideshow. So
yeah, I can't advance.
are you using the arrow keys at the bottom? There we are. Oh wait, we're back to seeing you.
Now I'm back to
Okay. Yeah.
To me.
This is one of the annoying things about Zoom. It makes it difficult to
Yes.
navigate through PowerPoint presentations and do them properly.
Um, yeah, I see everything else here. I see a chat. 38 participants. I do not see the slides.
Have you tried sharing your screen? Because it looks like you're not
Yeah,
sharing screen
let me
anymore.
share it again.
The green button at the
Yes.
bottom.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just
there we are.
all
There
right.
we
Now,
are. Okay.
now we're back. Um,
Okay. If you could just
although
advance it,
I
I think you could.
still,
Yeah.
I'm still missing the capability of advancing them.
Can you
Uh,
use the arrow keys on your?
uh,
Okay, there
oh,
we are. Perfect.
here we are.
Take it
Uh,
away.
I thought I'd start by just reminding ourselves exactly what science is. Uh, Science, as many of us know, has two components, just two components. Number one is observation, or the gathering of empirical evidence, and the other component is logic, to make sense of the evidence. It was the ancient Greeks who laid the foundations of what we call science, abstract science, as well as the scientific method. The modern scientific method really dates from the age of reason in the 17th and 18th centuries. We're turning now to weather extremes. The common perception, again, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is that weather extremes are becoming much more frequent and stronger. Simply climate change, it's a perception amplified by the mainstream media, and also helped by the fact that constant repetition of a false belief can, as we know over time, create the illusion of truth. In the political world, repetition of a lie is often termed a noble lie. In the world of propaganda, the most infamous example is probably that of the Nazi Joseph Goebbels during World War II. What is the reality? Well, the reality is that there's absolutely no evidence at all that either the frequency or the strength of extreme weather is increasing as the globe gets warmer. And this is true both today in the era of modern scientific instrumentation and in the past. Now, how do we know about the past? Essentially through various proxies, such as tree rings, sediment cores, ice cores, or leaf fossils. The fact is that heat waves, floods, droughts, hurricanes, tornadoes, and wildfires do not show any long-term trend. And as we'll see, in some cases, the trend is actually downward. So why do people believe the opposite? I'll come back to that at the end, but basically, it's a consequence of modern technology. The explosion of information, the advent of the internet and of smartphones. All right, let me take these one by one. Firstly, heat waves. It's fairly well known that the US heat waves of the 1930s were excessive. And in fact, they have not been exceeded even today. Nevertheless, environmental activists and the media often downplay that fact, and they say, well, it was all caused by the drought that followed the 1930s Dust Bowl. That's a plausible argument, but it's wrong, because the heat waves here, the US in the 1930s, were in fact part of a worldwide phenomenon of comparable heat waves in Europe, Asia, and even Australia. Here's an example of the US. The hottest years in the 30s were 1934 and 1936. In 1934, central Oklahoma recorded an amazing 36 successive days when the temperature exceeded 100 degrees. Now, it turns out that in this year, when the press made such a fuss about heat waves, there was actually a longer heat wave in El Paso, Texas, in which there were 44 consecutive days above 100 degrees. So one might say my original statement that heat waves of the 30s have not been exceeded today is incorrect. However, let's take another city, Phoenix, Arizona, because the climate in Phoenix is a lot hotter than that in El Paso, Texas. The baseline there is really 110 degrees rather than 100 degrees. That city saw only 31 consecutive days above that temperature this year. So arguably, this year, 2023, matched the heat waves of the 1930s, but it certainly didn't exceed them, which is the widespread claim made by the media and others. Some data showing the pattern over the last 120 years of heat waves in the US. The upper panel here shows the duration of heat waves, and the lower panel, the magnitude. And you see that the duration has fallen quite a bit, the solid blue line being the average. Here, in the 1930s, the average duration was about 11 days, whereas today that's dropped to about 6.5 days. Likewise, in the 1930s, the average magnitude was much, much higher, 3 times higher at least than it is today. Turning now to floods. The press made a big, you may remember, about floods in Pakistan last year in 2022. In fact, at one stage it was claimed that almost the whole country was underwater. The BBC, among other media entities, made that claim. That turned out to be wrong, and it was retracted later when nobody, of course, saw the retraction. It turned out about 10 to 12% of the country was flooded, some 33,000 square miles, and some 1,700 people died. But looking back in the past, that was nothing. In China, for example, 1931, the Yangtze River flooded after massive rainfall, I think about 24 inches in a short period of time. And a total area of almost 70,000 square miles was flooded, more than double that in Pakistan in 2022, affected a large number of people, and a staggering 2.4 million people died from that event, either from drowning or from subsequent starvation and disease. In Wuhan, the city that we know of, thanks to COVID, some 800,000 people were made homeless. And as one of the many consequences of that flooding, the local population even resorted to cannibalism. The belief that today's floods are worse than the past, apart from being a result of ignorance and lack of attention to what's happened before, is partly a result of population, more people building in harm's way on floodplains, either along rivers or along the coast. I will say one thing that the alarmists are right about. There are more flash floods today, not major that last for months, weeks and months, but flash floods. And this is a result of global warming, indeed. in a warming world, the atmosphere can hold more water. It's about 7% more for every 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature. And so that in itself leads to heavier precipitation. Another factor, not often appreciated, is that there's less water-absorbing countryside than there was 50 or 100 years ago, simply because it's been covered up with concrete and asphalt in cities. A consequence of that is shown in this next slide, which is due to Bjorn Lomborg. And this shows what he calls the expanding bullseye effect. The target here is a city growing in size from 1950 to 2040, in this hypothetical example. And you can see very clearly that as the city gets larger, the possibility of flooding from this river here increases considerably. That leads to the concept that damage from floods, and indeed from all natural disasters, is becoming much worse as the world warms. But in fact, as Lomborg points out, it's really just a consequence of increasing population and increasing wealth. Now let me turn to droughts, the opposite of floods. It's a fact, though the narrative would deny it. It's a fact that severe droughts have been a feature of the global climate for thousands and thousands of years, despite the fact that the media made a big fuss about the drought in Europe last year in 2022. The graph at the bottom here shows what's called the Palmer Drought Severity Index for the US back to the year 1895. It's really the percentage of the total land area in drought. And you see that over that whole span of time, in general, there's really no trend, except perhaps in those hot 1930s. There were, in fact, 4 separate droughts in the US, prolonged droughts during the 1930s. But otherwise, it's featureless. Going back in history, even further than 100 years, there have been lots of so-called mega droughts, both in Europe and in North America. Here's a graph that shows the drought area again, all the way back to the year 800 in North America. And what you can see here is that the period from 900 to 1300, which embraced the so-called medieval warm period, was much drier than the modern period shown by this little blue line to the right over here, when the percentage of the continent in drought was very much smaller. This is a reconstruction, by the way. I talked about proxies earlier. This is not, of course, actual instrumental data. It's data reconstructed from the width and color of tree rings. Next, I turn to hurricanes. Hurricanes is one of the weather extremes that I alluded to before, which is on the decline. Landfalling hurricanes in particular do show a decreasing trend all around the world. This particular chart here is for Florida, going back to the beginning of the instrumental area in 1850. And what it shows is the number of hurricanes per decade over that period. Major hurricanes are those that are in categories 3, 4, or 5. And what you see is the dark bars here show really there is no trend in major hurricanes, but hurricanes overall are unquestionably decreasing with time. And as I said, the same is true pretty much everywhere that hurricanes occur. The deadliest hurricane in US history struck the city of Galveston, Texas, a long time ago, back in the year 1900, killed as many as 12,000 people, mostly drowned from a storm surge of 15 feet that submerged the island. Been many landfalling hurricanes since, not quite as deadly, but devastating. For example, Hurricane Camille in 1969, which hit Mississippi, produced massive waves, 70-foot waves in the Gulf of Mexico, and actually beached two very large ships. The top wind speed couldn't even be measured for Camille because it was so powerful that all the measuring instruments were destroyed. Well, what about today? In 2022, last year, the deadliest hurricane that struck was Hurricane Ian. It killed a mere 156 people, all right? Still 156 deaths, but a whole lot less than 100 years earlier. The storm surge in that hurricane was comparable indeed to that in Galveston. Hurricane Camille, by the way, in addition to beaching ships, actually caused the Mississippi River to flow backwards for a brief period of time. So there really is no evidence that hurricanes today are any worse in their effect or devastating in the past. And in fact, either declining or steady. Here's a different graph that shows the frequency of all North Atlantic hurricanes. This includes those that made landfall, those that didn't make landfall, back to 1851. And you see essentially that the frequency is unchanged, although if you look carefully, you might notice that there appear to be less hurricanes in the period up until 1940. Well, the reason for that is simply that there was a lack of observations before that time. Most observations were based on eyewitness accounts. Here's a different example. Hurricanes in the Pacific, the Western Pacific, go by the name of typhoons. This is data from Japan showing the number of landfalling typhoons that struck Japan since 1950. Not really a decline here, but certainly not an increase. Now, tornadoes, one of the deadliest forms of extreme weather that have been in the news just recently in Tennessee. The deadliest tornado in the United States was the so-called tri-state outbreak in 1925. This was a combination of multiple F5 wind speeds up to 300, but also smaller ones, F4, 2, killed 700 people in 3 states. It persisted for an amazing 219 miles, lasted 3.5 hours, and was very, very wide. Most tornadoes, as you probably know, are quite narrow. This particular tornado was 1.5 miles in width. Among its many consequences was this one that I've noted here. A deputy sheriff in one of the cities was sucked into the funnel cloud and unfortunately never found. And some bodies, indeed, from this tri-state outbreak were carried as far as 1 mile across country by the force. Nevertheless, once again, tornadoes are decreasing. The annual number of strong tornadoes, that is those in categories EF3, EF4, or EF5, has gone down dramatically since 1950. And in fact, the average number of strong tornadoes shown at the graph down here from 1986 to 2017, that's the right-hand part of the graph, was 40% less than it was between 1954 and 1985. And for those that associate extreme weather with global warming, the irony here is that there was more global warming in the period when there were fewer tornadoes than in the earlier period when there were more tornadoes. So this really turns the narrative, the climate change narrative that extreme weather is caused by global warming, really turns that narrative on its head. There has been one change in the geography of tornadoes. There are fewer tornadoes today in what is called Tornado Alley. That's a band of land northward from Texas to the Plain States. Nonetheless, even tornado experts don't attribute that to climate change, to global warming. All right, lastly, wildfires. Wildfires, of course, are worst in dry climates, like here in California, where I live, Australia, where I grew up, and Spain. But nonetheless, like hurricanes and tornadoes, wildfires, contrary to popular belief, are on the decline pretty much all around the world. In the US, we have an agency called the US National Interagency Fire Center, which records wildfire data, or used to. Rather mysteriously, the agency recently scrubbed its website of all data prior to 1983. And that data showed a considerable decline in the earlier years of the 20th century. I personally find it hard not to believe that that was done for political reasons. The agency claims that the earlier data was unreliable. Some fires were recorded twice, for example, and other fires that weren't really wildfires at all were included. That may be true, but nonetheless, I find it very suspicious. However, even the data that survives still shows the same trend. In 2007, in the US, there were about 86,000 fires altogether, burned about 9 million acres. 15 years later, last year in 2022, the number of fires was down to about 69,000, and the area burned was correspondingly less. The graph at the bottom here shows the global pattern. This is by decade, shows the area burned globally per decade back to the year 19. And it's obvious that it's on the decline. And the rate of decline is actually it's fairly steady. It's about 7% per decade over the last century. One of the facts generally unknown about wildfires is that, yes, that the humans are often responsible, but not by causing global warming, by arson. You probably remember there were hundreds of deadly wildfires in Greece this year in 2023. Many of those, by far the majority, were started by arsonists. The press actually had to admit this finally when 79 of those arsonists in Greece were arrested. Here's a chart that shows same pattern in Australia, decline in the, in this case, this is the percentage of total land area burned since 1900. A fairly steady decline, with this notable exception, 1974, when some 15% of the total land area was burned, and I think something like 60,000 farm animals were killed. But that is obviously an outlier. All right, now I want to return to a point I started to make at the beginning, and that is how extreme events get recorded. In the early 20th century, the answer is they didn't really get recorded because many of the events occurred in sparsely populated areas of the globe. Let's take hurricanes as an example. Mentioned some of this before. Before the 1950s, hurricane records relied heavily on eyewitness accounts. Well, you can see that for a start, that would immediately exclude hurricanes that didn't make landfall. Some of those non-landfalling hurricanes were recorded by ships at sea, but that was spotty data because not all ships at sea bothered to record them or were in the right area to record them. And so those numbers are very likely an undercount. Remarked on that earlier hurricane graph that there was to be fewer hurricanes before 1940, 1950. Oops. Very good. How do I go backward here? Well, never mind.
Ralph, you can just there's a back key on the opposite side of the advance key.
I don't see it, but it doesn't matter. What is true today is that we have extensive, still talking about hurricanes, we have extensive satellite coverage. And that very fact means that there is an apparent increase because every single hurricane is getting noted, whereas in the past it was not. And that alone means that there's a general perception that hurricanes are on the increase aside from increase in the broadcast of information through the internet and smartphones. The same is true of tornadoes, wildfires, and possibly floods. All right. Population gain, as I mentioned, is also a factor. 100 years ago, the population of the US is only about 1/3 of what it is today. And of course, that makes a big difference in both recording and reacting to extreme weather events. As I've said before, property damage from extreme weather, such as major floods and hurricanes, has been greatly, apparently increased, or in fact, it has been increased by the building of homes in harm's way. Population expansion beyond urban areas, as we saw in that slide about the expanding bullseye effect, has elevated both the death toll and property damage from things like tornadoes and wildfires. Particular issue of property damage has been covered quite extensively by Roger Pelkey Jr., who I believe has participated in several other webinars in this series. Lastly, another factor that I haven't mentioned before, that's fear, the exploitation of fear. I came across this quote from a sociologist, interestingly enough, about extreme weather. The term extreme weather works not so much as a scientific, but as a cultural metaphor to capture the anxieties of our time. In contemporary culture, extreme weather is often interpreted through a moralistic narrative that presents it as the inevitable threatening outcome of irresponsible human behavior. In other words, we're bad and we caused all this bad weather. Okay, I'm going to thank you. Turn that off for now. I seem lost sound.
Okay, I think I should be back. Am
Okay,
I?
yes, I hear you.
Okay. This microphone sometimes just decides to take time off, and so I have to quickly unplug it and plug it in again.
Okay, I see we've got some questions here.
Yeah. I uh, we could just address a couple of them right now, and there are a couple of questions that are wondering about the data sources, and I just want to mention that I've put several links to Ralph's blog and places where he writes, and there may be more information there. But Ralph, what about the data sources that you took this material from?
Yes, I realize that I didn't provide any of those in the slides. Um, they're from a variety of places, many from government agencies such as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. I'd have to check, but I've written a series of reports on extreme weather for the Global Warming Policy Foundation. References to all the data are included in those reports. The three of them published so far. I've just completed a fourth. So you could find sources for all of the graphs I showed, and in fact, many others that I did not show. You could find the sources referenced in those publications.
Yeah, yeah. One of those reports, I believe it was called Chinese Whispers. And
Yes.
yeah, and there's a link to that on the in the chat box, by the way. One of the several links that I put up there. So please be sure to have a look at those. Those of you in the audience who are interested in this sort of thing. And there you make the connection between the science. Well, you outline the connection between the science and the kind of public fear mongering that you closed out your presentation with, and you likened it to Chinese whispers, or as we call it, a game of telephone. The kids gather in a circle. Someone says something, they whisper it to their partner, and then they see what comes out of the other end. And it's often what comes out of the other end is often much different from what went in. And
True.
and you mentioned that this is due to garbling of the message passed along at each step of the way. And I wonder if it's really that accidental. The the thing that strikes me about the kind of incredible distortion of climate science by the news media, by the government, and so forth, is that everyone in that chain of events is acting rationally, really, in terms of what interests them. And every one of these actors has a different set of interests that they want to promote either or de-promote. And so news media, for example, they want to get attention, and
Yes.
they imagine that they're writing to an either subliterate or sub average intelligence audience to do that. And so
They want to
those
keep
actors
up
are acting
this.
those actors are acting perfectly rationally, as are government actors who take this information and use it to promote what interests them, which is aggrandizing power and money. And so uh, is it really accidental, or are there multiple agendas being at work here, or is there some kind of grand, overarching. I hesitate to use the word conspiracy, but that pretty much describes it to impose a broad political agenda on the rest of us.
Yeah,
Where do you stand on that?
it's a good question, and I think there is some truth in that each party chain um, has their own motive for presenting data and arguments the way they do. Newspapers, for example, are on the decline, so they're trying to bolster their sales. Let me go back to the beginning of that chain, which I wrote about in Chinese Whispers, because that was the IPCC, the International Panel for Climate Change. That, as you may know, that panel has several components, one of which is, to my way of thinking, is purely political, and one of which is pretty much purely scientific. And the science and the scientific part, which is part one of their report they produce every 5 or 6 years, is usually fairly honest and expresses a lot of reservations about the science. There's I would say there's relatively little bias in that particular part of the report. But by the time it gets made public, there is definitely some deliberation involved, because it goes through bureaucrats and lots of representatives from non-governmental organizations and even government organizations before, and it gets reprocessed. It firstly gets condensed. I mean, the original report is a couple of thousand pages long. That gets condensed into about a 30-page summary, which is presented to the media. All of those people that are involved in that exercise, we've seen some of that in the last week at the Conference of the Parties, which is a sort of annual jamboree, which achieves nothing on mitigation of global warming. The same, I think, the same thing happens in the presentation of the IPCC report. So yes, I would say it's actually getting the message that is received at the end of the is a combination of deliberately introduced misinformation and accidentally heard or misheard information in transmission. Yes.
Okay, so we come back to the issue of what's motivating these actors, and I think we have a tendency to treat the sciences as victims in this whole thing. The scientists are bringing integrity to the table of this process, and in many instances, that's absolutely right. And this point has been made both by you and also by people like Roger Pielke, who talk about the disconnect between the public, the summary for policymakers, I think it's called, and what the scientists are saying to them. And so, that can be ascribed to this game of telephone that you're describing. But scientists themselves are kind of to blame for the misinformation, aren't they? I mean, you featured the Michael Mann's hockey stick in there, and of course, I bring this up with some trepidation because Michael Mann and others have managed to tie some people up in years of court litigation over over allegations that it's really not very credible, and so. This speaks to the politicization of science itself, right? We can trot out all the data that we want, but if it doesn't align with this broad political agenda, it's going to be suppressed, and you're going to find no shortage of scientists really that will come in and help turn the screws. Why do you think that we have this kind of corruption among our fellow scientists?
Well, I know that's a question that you've written about yourself recently. It comes, I would say, it comes partly from personal self-interest. Scientists are humans, just like everybody else, susceptible to human weakness. But more particularly, as you've written, and I've written indeed in one of my books, from the funding arrangement. It was, as you know, it was Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, who first warned against this 60, 70 years ago. And unfortunately, he was right. I mean, there was a transition in the years after World War II from science conducted largely for the sake of science and funded in by no particular source. There was a transition from that to funding based heavily on money from the government and the establishment of bureaucracies like the National Science Foundation. And the problem with that, of course, is once that happens, once the funding is tied to a government entity, the politics of that entity are naturally going to influence the outcome of the science. In climate science in particular, I know of many, well, let me put it this way. Most skeptics, like myself, in climate science, although I wasn't a climate scientist, but even those who were climate scientists, most skeptics are retired. And the reason for that is that while they held research and teaching positions, they dare not speak out against the consensus, against the narrative, for sake of, number one, losing their funding, number two, even worse, losing their jobs. And I know of several instances in which exactly that has happened. And especially for young scientists, those at the beginnings of their career, that's crucial. I mean, they've got years and years, hopefully, ahead of them in their profession, and they don't want to jeopardize that by stepping out of line. So I think that's probably one of the biggest factors. Another factor, I think, is the publication world, journals. That world has been corrupted, partly by the rise of these, what are they called? I've forgotten the.
Is it open source that you're thinking of?
The open source, yes, the open source publications. Some of those, are reputable, but I think that's been a factor in clouding this barrier. And another would be peer review. That process indeed has become corrupted into what we know as power review. I mean, I think all of those are unfortunately. Let me say one other thing too, because you alluded to this. Not all climate scientists are good scientists. Many climate scientists are activists. I mean, take Jim Hansen, for example. There are many others. They claim that they're promoting true science, but what they write, what they say is full of bias, even if they don't recognize it. So I don't know what the answer is to eliminating that, to somehow separating these and getting science, and this, as you know, is not just true in climate science, and getting science back to its roots, as it were.
So this leads into a question from Larry, and I think you partly answered it right now. He says, I appreciate arguments based on good data and try to pay attention to the interpretations given those data by knowledgeable scientists. But what can be done when people, and he includes media, politicians, etc., have simply no interest in data or the derived scientific interpretations? And he goes on to say that it seems like arguing the science in those cases is a waste of time, since it will be ignored, and that some other way of ensuring the victory of logical reality has to be found. Do you have any further thoughts on how we bring back logical reality to the sciences? How do we do
Well,
that?
maybe I'm an idealist, but I would say the answer lies in education. We are miseducating. We're not only misinforming a lot of adults, we are miseducating a lot of our children, a lot of our young people. Now, whether that can be reversed, I don't know, but I truly feel that, the answer is there. I mean, in many fields, I mean, go off on a slight tangent, for example, look how many people, young people in the United States today are unaware of the Holocaust, for example. I mean, that's a different debate, but many young people are not taught very much science any longer. And I think this is unfortunate. And what science they are taught is often either watered down or it's misinformed. In climate science, for example, there are textbooks now presenting the official narrative on climate science, which is that global warming is all a result of human intervention, human emissions of CO2. There are a few books I'm glad to see that present a more scientific view, but getting those into the education system, of course, is a difficult job.
Yeah, and we saw the depth of the issue again on a topic that's not related to what we're talking about today, but not climate change rather, but in the debacle of the presidents of Penn, MIT, and Harvard, and their atrocious testimony there, and more than anything, that just illustrates the depth of
Yes.
degradation, in my opinion, to which our universities have sunk. And I, like you, don't know how to do it. We've had someone like Randy Wayne, for example, at Cornell University, who has been on this program a couple of times, and he strikes me as the professor's professor. That is, he knows what it is to be an academic, the values associated with that, and he's standing virtually alone at Cornell University and defending those values very strenuously. And there are no shortage of people that I can point to that are doing the same thing. They're in the universities, they're doing the good fight, they're standing up for their ideals, and yet here we are, and
Yes.
and again, I don't know how to do that except to go in and root out the source of the corruption, which is politics and money, basically governing the activities of academics and scientists. And maybe the system has failed. Maybe the whole IPC system has failed because the scientists don't seem to be having much of an impact on the policy conclusions. And it's the
Yes.
policy conclusions that are controlling the money, controlling the power, and so forth. And so we've gone into, I think, what you and other people like John Stadden have described as an age of unreason, where it's these political motivations. Never mind what the science is saying. Never mind what the evidence is saying. We're just going to go this way because it empowers us and not you.
Yes. yes. Unfortunately, I think you're right. Um, One of the barriers of many is this perception in science, anyway, or climate science, is the notion that Al Gore first vocalized that the science is settled. I mean, that's obviously anathema to anything, because science, as we know, is never settled. There's this lack of understanding in the public at large, and yes, it extends to the universities too, unfortunately, about what science is and should be and can be. Um, I don't know, I don't know how to reverse that. It's almost like the problem permeates the whole system from top to bottom, bottom to top.
So, do you think that the sciences are even relevant these days to these policy debates? I mean, everyone
Right,
goes through the performative motion of saying, "Oh, well, let's see what the scientists say," but
right,
then
right.
if you don't like what science says, then too bad. So,
Yeah, I, as I said, I mean, I am an optimist, and even though I don't see any immediate solution, what I do know is that, and you know too, is that history has been cyclical. And what is fashionable in one era becomes unfashionable in another. The wheel does turn, albeit very, very slowly sometimes. And it's my opinion that probably long after you and I are on this earth, um, there will be a shift back to an age of more reason than certainly there is now. But in fact, that's more emotional than rational. I don't know if it's you know a
yeah,
rational hope.
I think the so-called Dark Ages had a longer shelf life than the Enlightenment
Yes, they
has. You know,
did.
just
They
looking
did.
at it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
which is which
yeah,
is despairing and yet hopeful at the
yeah,
same time.
yeah.
So,
I read articles that that suggest just that in fact the periods of rationality in human history are few and far between. And
mm,
as you say, the Dark Ages in between what tend to dominate. And unfortunately, we seem to
mm,
be or heading toward one of the dark ages right now.
mm. And like you, I actually have no real understanding of how to do it, except for some things that are likely to cause a great deal of pain and face a great deal of resistance from the establishment, to use
Yeah.
a well-worn word.
Let
Paul's,
me just add
hmm,
one thought. Um, this is really specific to global warming. I often think that the one thing that actually will change this whole um, situation is new evidence, which of course would be scientific. I mean, if we enter a period of global cooling, which some more than a few people have predicted might start the late 1920s or 1930s, if that were to happen, it seems to me that at least some of the people on the alarmist side of the debate would have second thoughts. And that would, and I say, that that's actual scientific evidence, what nature does, so you can't dispute. But
I hope so, but as you well know, climate change began as an alarm over global cooling,
yes,
and there was no difficulty in making that transition to first global warming and then to all-purpose climate change and now into the climate catastrophe that if I look out my window, I'm actually not seeing much evidence of.
right.
So again, politics seems to be in the driver's seat, and I'm not sure how scientists are supposed to influence politics. And of course, the Roger Pielke, as you have has pointed out, that that if you look at the recommendation of the scientists, it's becoming less and less alarmist over time. We've gone from drastic case scenarios, I don't remember how they're designated, down to relatively moderate scenarios where we can actually get into the realm of what people like Bjorn Lomborg have said we have always been, which is that, okay, it's an issue, but it's coming slowly, it can be mitigated, and we should be focusing our efforts on those kinds of things. And yet it doesn't seem to be reflected in the alarmism over climate change, the public treatment of it, the way that the politicians have been responding to it. The climate catastrophe becomes ever less credible a way of rendering it with every issuance of the next IPCC report. The science seems to be converging on it. Well, this is not so much of a problem, and yet the policy responses seem to be going in the exact opposite way. And maybe there's a political solution to that. Maybe there's not. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, that goes back to to what I said very early in my
Yeah,
presentation about
yeah.
repetition of lies, what
Mm,
are in effect lies,
yeah,
and that
yeah.
becomes very hard to deal with. I mean, after all,
Hmm.
um, what what ended Goebbels' propaganda? It's
It's
a
World War
lot of
II.
effort and a lot of money
Yeah,
in a big war,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. There are several questions that are coming in here, and as I'm looking
Yes,
them over, I just want to come back to one of the slides that you showed in your presentation, that of the Australian wildfires, and
yes,
you showed the trend, and then you showed this dot way up at the top, very
yes,
extreme year, and of course, we've seen this kind of thing also in wildfires in California with the big wildfires a couple of years ago. And of course, the people who are responsible for managing the forests, the power grid, and so forth, they practically trampled each other trying to blame it on climate change. And then it comes out that, well, it's due to forest mismanagement, it's due to poor maintenance of the electrical grid, and so forth. And so, in that sense, climate change has become the sort of all-purpose excuse for failure. And so, you don't have to go to something as quite as say conspiratorial as this uniform resort to power and money. It can simply be the convenient excuse for failure. You can blame anything on climate change, and we've seen this many
right.
times. And so, do you have any thoughts on which is the seeking of power, and which is just a bunch of incompetent people who don't want to take responsibility for their actions?
Well, yes, I didn't mention forest mismanagement, of course. That's probably the most important source of wildfires. But yeah, I, I don't really know what the answer is. The political forces, as you know, are very, very strong. Um, Going back to what you just mentioned about Roger Pelkey, um, I mean, he must often feel that he's banging his head against the proverbial brick wall because, I
I don't
mean,
know how he does it.
he's been making this point very rashly and with lots of detail and science that
Yeah,
all of these catastrophic projections about the future are based on an projection, I think called RCP 8.5,
yeah,
whereas we should be looking at RCP like 3.5. And no one seems to take any notice. It just gets promulgated constantly. Um,
mm,
I
yeah, yeah,
it's a
mm,
battle. Part of the reason is what we were talking about before. There's a lack of appreciation in general of science, and I
yeah,
think it would be a good thing if that could be reversed. It was
yeah,
reversed briefly, as you'll recall, in the 1960s, But again, that came out of fear. You know, the Russians put a satellite into orbit, and here in the States, we got in a panic. How can that be? We need to pour more money into
Yeah.
science and technology. And for a while, science was, you know, was a big thing. But
Yeah.
of course,
Yeah.
that ended once we put a man on the moon. It was over.
Yeah. Went away. Yeah, and just full disclosure, the amount of money that was poured into that actually paid for my graduate education, and so, we've all been participating in this.
Yes.
Sometimes to good end, and sometimes not so much. So there are a couple of interesting questions that have come in. Paul Saunders has made a couple of related comments, and I'll just read those out. He says that, first of all, that the Age of Unreason, which we spoke about a little while ago, began with Immanuel Kant and has spiraled downward ever since through Hegel, Comte de Buffon, Marx, Wittgenstein, Marcuse, Derrida, Foucault, etc. And so he's pointing to his next comment, which is that the solution is not really going to be political or scientific, but it's actually going to be a philosophical change of mind. Philosophical with respect to what, I'm not quite sure from Paul's comment. Perhaps he can elaborate on it. But do you think that we're just on the wrong philosophical track here? That we've gone on to a way of thinking about things that just shoves the politics and the science, for that matter, off to the side? Do you think that's one
Yes,
of the reasons why we've had
that's a
this
very,
disconnect?
very good point. Maybe that's the whole problem.
Hmm. And so, do you have a philosophical alternative that's better? I mean, I would say reason, but do you have
Right.
any
No,
ways to
as I said,
elaborate on that simple thing?
yeah, no, I mean, I guess my answer is more of more practical bent. I would say yes,
Hmm.
reason and education again,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which of course is education system is really, in a sense, philosophy too.
Mm, yeah. And of course, the question is philosophy of what? And
Right.
I think this is one thing where maybe Paul can tell us something about
By the
what
way,
his thinking
talking
is.
about questions, I see we got one from Dick Linson.
Yes, I see that. Dick was a guest on our webinar a couple
Yes,
weeks
that's right.
ago. As everyone here knows, he's really one of the preeminent climate realists. I don't like, well, skeptic is okay. It's better than denier, but I think
Yes.
realist is the better one. But he says, hasn't the IPCC Working Group 1 reached the same conclusions that you presented? So is there any daylight between what you're presenting here and the conclusions of IPCC Working Group 1?
I'm not actually sure what he means by that. I'm a big fan of,
Hmm.
of Dick Linson's, and I've read many of his articles and speeches. Um,
Hmm.
I have to admit, though, I'm not quite sure what he's getting at.
I think he's meaning the Working Group 1, which is the group of scientists that is supposed to form the scientific
Oh, I
recommendations to
see.
the
I see.
policymakers.
I see. Um, well, my answer would be mostly, but not completely. Um, the IPC has well, until until the most recent round of IPCC reports, the IPC was neutral on the question of weather extremes and whether there's any connection between them, or any increase that could be attributed to global warming. But in the most recent report, they did change their tune. And in fact, one of the GWPF reports I alluded to before has that title, is the IPCC changing its tune, because they now say, or they've expressed some reservations, which I don't fully agree with, that maybe there is some evidence And I still, as I've just described, don't see any evidence. Even with heat waves, one of the problems to me, where the IPC is concerned with heat waves, is that they now look at data only back to 1960, the argument being that there was insufficient data before 1960, just like there was less hurricane data. Well, I don't see how you can draw long-term conclusions unless you look at all the data, even if it is somewhat deficient.
Yeah, this cherry picking is a real problem, and I was really pleased that you emphasized the period in the early part of the 20th century when actually weather events were more extreme than they are right now. But you never see that addressed in a lot of the data-driven
Right.
discussions of climate change as really an example of the worst kind of cherry picking. And yeah, and so I I agree with you. I think this kind of cherry picking is very prevalent, and unfortunately, it opens the door for people to sort of divert the skeptical argument by trying to uh, flummox the person making the claim by throwing up data claims and where's the data and this, that, and the other. And of course, there's a lot of data about climate, as you know,
Right.
and keeping track of all of it is very, very difficult. You don't always have those data at the top of your head, and so it's a very easy way to actually divert a discussion away from rationality to again advance this very blatant political agenda.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've been accused of cherry picking myself,
Mm-hmm.
especially on this pet topic of mine of weather extremes, which
Mm-hmm.
is one of the reasons I've written so many detailed reports just to,
Yeah.
in fact, there's one that's not published yet, which looks at not so much at data which I've presented before. It includes data, but it also includes archived newspaper accounts of extreme weather events that occurred over the last 100 years, just to illustrate that there was just as much fuss um, about such events 100 years ago as there is now, and the events themselves were just as, or if not more, catastrophic.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's the projections of the climate change promoters actually extend centuries into the future, and they're made with some confidence. And yet,
I
these
know.
kinds of important, anecdotal yet still very important issues are ignored when the narrative goes the other way. One of the one of the really striking bits of evidence about the extremes in the 1930s was comparative pictures of the glaciers on Mount Kilimanjaro, and everyone's going, "Oh, the glaciers are disappearing on Kilimanjaro," and yet if you go back to the 1930s and you look at photographs that tourists took at the very same place, the glaciers are gone. So they come and they
Right.
go, and it goes with climate, and there are periods when the climate was more extreme than we're looking at, and perhaps even more extreme than some of the projections that we're seeing from the climate alarmists.
Right. I just dug up well, I didn't dig it up actually. It came to me, it was supplied to me by a reviewer of the report, still unpublished, that I just mentioned, of very strong tropical cyclones, as they call them there in Queensland, Australia. But that was 200 years ago. And there's good evidence that they were more numerous and much stronger than anything since. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
there are lots of examples like that in history.
yeah, yeah. Um, Paul Sanders has responded to my request for a bit more detail on the philosophical issues, and he just mentions that the most pro-reason modern philosophy is the objectivism of Ayn Rand, which is an improvement
Ah,
upon Aristotle's epistemology, which is an interesting one because I think that the contributions of the Greek philosophers, the Socratic philosophers, to our present day way of thinking is much derided and much ignored. It goes all the way from simply not being able to or not having had the opportunity to delve into the writings of these individuals for various reasons. They're dead white males. Never mind, they may not have been, just a standard Anglo-Saxon white male, but the kind of scientific mindset that permeates our scientific culture right now really is not Aristotelian. It's not geared towards those kinds of purpose-driven philosophies that came out of the pre-Socratics. Science now prides itself on being materialistic, on looking at things that are highly valued in the Enlightenment. As you say, the Enlightenment values include looking at evidence, not bringing in, gods where they're not necessary, or things that can't be reduced to evidence or observation. And so there's a bit of a tension there, isn't it? Because the prevailing scientific mindset of the Enlightenment may be running into its limits here when we talk about a complex issue like climate change, which brings into the picture a whole lot of complex systems, a whole bunch of interacting systems, and of course the deliberate and I would argue purposeful behavior of living things in all this. I've always thought that the big missing issue of climate science is that it doesn't take adequate account of the contribution of the biosphere to climate, and in fact, the contribution of the biosphere is very, very large. And But unfortunately, most of my biologist colleagues who should be able to present this kind of thing, they've been sort of beaten into submission as well, in part because they get funding for pursuing it. And as
yeah,
we all know, science. Yes, go on.
One of the things that's always shocked me somewhat, talking about biologists, is how many of them, at least how many of the prominent ones, are climate alarmists. Richard Dawkins, for example.
Yeah.
But he's by far not the only one.
Yeah, I know. It's I've had colleagues who've been funded to do climate change research on communities, and I won't name the person, but found that the communities they were being paid to study, the likely behavior was the exact opposite of what the climate change models were saying. And that put this person in a bit of a pickle. Do I publish and lose my funding, or do I just go along and try to make it fit into the narrative so I can keep my funding stream going? And I'm not diminishing that at all, because, as you say, science now runs on money. People have careers, they have responsibilities, and so forth. And it's very, very hard to step out and buck that trend, I think. So, okay.
Just going back to Paul Saunders' comment for a moment. I agree, and Rand is probably a better starting point than Aristotle. I thought actually that Aristotelian thinking had sort of gone out the window around the time of Galileo, because among other beliefs of the Aristotelian community, as you know, was the geocentric theory, that the Earth was at the center of the solar system and not the sun. But I can't say I'm anything of an expert on Aristotelian ideas.
Yeah. Nor am I, but Aristotle stands out to biologists because compared to Plato, he was really an up to your elbows biologist. He actually did dissections. He actually
Yes,
studied
he did. He
animals and
did.
plants, and of course, his writings on all subjects was vast. So, the deeper you go into it, and I can't say I've dived very deeply into it myself, the more you find. And so perhaps Paul, in the few minutes that we have left, could perhaps elaborate a little bit on how
Yes.
objectivism is related to Aristotle's epistemology. He does cite Harry
I saw
Binswanger
that.
at
Yes.
Columbia University, but perhaps he could give us a one sentence description of their
Yeah.
similarities, if that's at all possible. And if you could do it in the next 2 minutes, that would be great.
Right.
Otherwise, let me just say that if we don't get to all the questions today, that you're welcome to send them to me at my email address. That's turner@nas.org, and I'll pass them on to Ralph for you. And the webinar, our conversation today, will be posted on YouTube very shortly after we're done here. And the comment section under the YouTube video is also a good place to carry on discussions. And
Mhm.
we monitor those comments, reply to them when we can. And so, if we don't get to your questions today, because we're running very short on time now, please feel free to reach out to us to get your questions to Ralph. And the YouTube comments is a good way to do it publicly, like we're doing here today.
Should I post links to those reports that I mentioned, which provide data sources on YouTube?
It would be helpful, but maybe not so much on this, because the chat session goes away when we conclude
Oh,
here. and
that's
and
right.
and
That's
so
right.
I've already posted some links to certain things, and those are on the chat session in the few minutes we have left. If you haven't seen them, feel free to go and copy them and paste them into whatever that you have. But also, I'll be posting those links to some various things about you, Ralph, on the YouTube
Okay.
YouTube comments. And of course, if you have some other things that you'd like to put up there, I only have a few things related to what you do. I've given your feed on the Science Under Attack, your own blog. I've provided links to your writings on the Clintel website and so forth. But there's much,
Okay.
much more that I'm sure could go in there,
I'll take
and
a look. Yes.
that would be a good place to do it. Okay, let's just wrap things up with okay, so Paul Sanders has given us his best effort at a 2-minute thumbnail sketch, basically a list of things in order right there. Please do have a look
Nice.
at this.
Yes.
I can't really give it justice in the couple of minutes
Right.
we
That's a lot
have
to.
left, but thank you very much, Paul, for
Yes. Thank you
for
indeed.
uh, for doing that. And let's just wrap things up here. Dave Peterson has mentioned that if corruption in the physical sciences is omnipresent and very deep, what is it about this, or does this actually occur in other sciences as well? And he points up the social sciences as being especially vulnerable. And we see things in what he describes as psychopathologies like transgenderism, gender dysphoria, or those kinds of things. And so, do you think that science in general has fallen under the sway of this corrupting influence that's damaging our rational debate about climate?
As I as I think I've said in my Science Under Attack, the problem is actually worse in the social sciences than it is in the physical sciences. One of the physical sciences, however, which stands above all others, oddly enough, is medicine.
Hmm.
There is a lot of corruption, falsification of data, irreducibility of results in the medical area, but all of those are quite prominent. It's been found in some of the sociology, I won't say, well, in sociology and psychology and some of the other social sciences. So it would seem to me it's a rather pervasive factor.
Yeah, big problem to solve. So we've reached the end of our time today. Before I turn the floor over to you for any final thoughts, Ralph, let me just mention a couple things about the webinar series in National Association of Scholars. Again, this webinar series is sponsored by the National Association of Scholars. We're a membership organization, and if you're already a member, we really appreciate your ongoing support here. And if you enjoyed our webinar and are not a member, maybe think about joining us. We're a good group, and a lot of people tell us that we're maybe making some progress on the troubles that face academia today. This particular episode right here with Ralph Alexander is going to be the last Restoring the Sciences episode for this calendar year. In the meantime, until we come back on next year, I want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas. And of course, Hanukkah is over today here in upstate New York. It's within minutes away. I'm going to just wish everyone a retrospective happy Hanukkah. And please do keep your eye out for us. We're still we're still finalizing guest lists to kick off the new year for the webinar, but those aren't settled yet. So please just keep an eye out for what we're doing on the National Association of Scholars website. And with that, Ralph, I want to thank you very much for appearing, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you for any final thoughts that you might have.
Well, thank you, Scott, for this opportunity to presentation as part of this wonderful series. I'll make my final message very simple in the form of an appeal to all those listening or viewing. Do what you can to promote science and to help save it from destruction.
Well, on that note, I couldn't agree more. And again, thank you, Ralph, for coming on. And again, everyone, have a Merry Christmas, have a good New Year, and enjoy the few minutes of Hanukkah that's left today.
Same for me too.